So you can see, for example, in this graph here, the sort of exponential rise in people who are living alone after the age of 18, right? Look at this data in a different way. Similarly, the percent of Americans aged 18 and over living alone has risen over the last few decades, almost doubled. That was to 2017. I suspect it's kept going up. Slightly newer data here showing that this large increase in both men and women from 1990 to 2021, endorsing the statement that they have no close friends. Okay, so for men, that went from 3% in 1990 to 15% in 2021. And for women, 6% to 10%, right? And you can look across the entire distribution, there's these increases. And yet, despite these sort of larger trends, they're definitely part of the experience of loneliness, living alone, and so on. Maybe the technology that we have is contributing to this somehow as well. But these externals aren't really what loneliness is about. In the scientific literature, loneliness is defined as being more about our subjective sense of connection or disconnection, rather than sort of objectively how many friends we have or how frequently we're having social interaction and so on, right? So someone could actually have many friends and a very rich social life on the outside, and yet internally still feel this sense of loneliness. So here's actually a scientific definition, as recognition about loneliness for a long time now, this is from 1981, that loneliness is a subjective, unwelcome feeling of lack or loss of companionship, which happens when there is a mismatch between the quantity and quality of the social relationships that we have and those we want, right? So it's about our perception primarily, and that gives rise to this feeling of loneliness. Despite the fact that it's largely a subjective experience, that isn't meant to minimize its relevance or its impact on for our health and well-being. So loneliness actually has a profound negative impact on our mental and physical health. Here's just some of the things that have been shown by research to be associated with loneliness. Greater likelihood or risk for chronic health conditions, including heart disease, weakened immune system, greater rates of depression and anxiety. It increases the likelihood and the earlier onset of things like dementia or Alzheimer's disease, earlier admissions to nursing homes or use of emergency services, and actually, increased likelihood of an earlier death associated with loneliness as well. And researchers have actually quantified this and talked about that, at a certain point, loneliness is equivalent, the experience of loneliness, to smoking 15 cigarettes per day. That's how detrimental it is on our physical health. And we can look to the brain as well. So this is a recent review published about the relationship between different areas of the brain, both in structure and function, and the experience of loneliness. And what it really shows is that the brain on loneliness looks different, right? So we would expect this, but it's nice to see the data here sort of concretizes our understanding of loneliness. It's not just a subjective thing. There's something happening in the brain. And we'll come back to this later on, but these are areas of the brain that are implicated in things like social rejection and self-criticism and emotion dysregulation. Okay, so this is so much of an issue that researchers have termed loneliness to be an epidemic because of its influences on all of these different other health issues and because of its spread and the growth of loneliness within our society right now over time. And as if that weren't enough, turns out that loneliness is also contagious. Okay, what do I mean by that? Loneliness is contagious. Well, a study looked at the structure and the spread of loneliness over time within a town. This is part of something called the Framingham Heart Study, which is a longitudinal study examining a whole town over time. And so lots and lots of data collected, and they're able to see, because it's longitudinal, when one person becomes lonelier, it increases the likelihood of those around them becoming lonelier as well. So if one of your friends, it turns out that friends actually have a bigger impact than family members in this way. One of your friends becomes lonelier, I think it increases your chances of becoming lonelier by something like 40 to 60%. And if a friend of a friend becomes lonelier, it increases your chances by something like 30% of becoming lonelier. And if a friend of a friend of a friend, okay, this is that 3 degrees of separation or influence, becomes lonelier, it's up to 25% increasing the risk. And so here's actually a visualization of the data itself showing this. So I don't know if the colors will be clear to you all, but the yellow is the least lonely individuals, the green is the next most lonely, and the blue is the most lonely of the group, 3 or more days per week reporting feeling lonely. And you can see that those are occurring in clusters, right? And because again, it was a longitudinal study, they are able to show that as one individual in this node becomes lonelier, it's increasing the likelihood of those around them getting lonelier as well. So how does this work? How does it work that loneliness is contagious? It's not something really intuitive, at least it wasn't to me. So John Cacioppo was one of the primary researchers involved in this kind of early work on loneliness and thinking about loneliness as an epidemic. And he was asked this question, and he says, it's actually stunningly simple as a mechanism. In one study, we looked at people's connections every 3 to 4 years. This process happens over time. Let's say you and I are neighbors, and you have become lonely for some reason, and you are my friend. As a suddenly lonely person, I am now more likely to deal with you cautiously, defensively, as a potential threat to me. Okay, so there's a shift in social behavior that occurs when we become lonelier. And that shift is a little bit like putting some armor on, putting our guard up. We're less willing to be vulnerable in our interpersonal interactions, perhaps because there's this fear, right, of further social rejection, and the pain of that feels like it would be too much. And you recognize that, so we are going to have more negative social, I think I should say, interactions. And over 3 or 4 years, we are more likely to stop being friends. So that is one less confidant for both of us, okay? Confidant, as thought about in this context, has to do with someone who we can both offer advice to, and we can also receive sort of something from them. So there's a give and take in the relationship, a giving and receiving. So that's going to be an important term that we'll return to later on. And then it goes on, right? It doesn't end there. Because you interact less well with me as a neighbor, when you go to work, we can see you are more likely to interact negatively with someone else. And it goes on, right? So it's this very concrete thing, actually, how loneliness spreads. It has to do with the way that it shifts our social behavior over time, and then the consequences of that in terms of having confidants and the way that that impacts our previous confidants' well-being and so on. So what's the answer here? Researchers have been really interested in this, especially since it was sort of studied enough to understand just what a big problem this is within our society, the sort of fraying of the fabric of society, the social fabric. And so they looked at a bunch of different kinds of things that you could do. And we're going to go through these now. The first thing that researchers looked at to see whether it would help reduce people's loneliness is an increase in social engagement. But it turned out that didn't work because it confuses objective with subjective isolation, right? Loneliness isn't actually about the frequency of contact we have. It's more about our inner experience of the quality of that contact. So just taking lonely people and increasing the amount of social interaction they have doesn't work because it's not actually targeting the subjective roots of loneliness. The next thing they tried was social skills. There's this idea that lonely people just maybe have poorer social skills, and that's what's resulted in them feeling lonely over time. So let's train people in getting better at socializing, and maybe they'll naturally go out and make more friends and so on. But it actually turns out that the causation's in the other direction. Lonely people aren't poor at social skills to begin with, but loneliness changes our social behavior in systematic ways that results in these poor social skills. So yes, it's true that loneliness is associated with kind of different social interaction behavior and so on, but the relationship is the other way around. They also looked at social support here as a sort of more formal thing, like having a therapist or being part of different groups and so on. Turned out that didn't work because in order to overcome loneliness, you need confidants, that word I referred to earlier. where you feel that there's both giving and receiving in the social interaction. So if it's just a therapist, that therapist can help you in a variety of different ways. But if you're thinking that that's going to reduce loneliness, it's not going to be a direct route for that, because the therapist is more of a one-directional relationship, right? So that kind of formal support didn't help with loneliness either. So we're left with this last one, at least the last option that I have on the slides, right? Let's hope this works in some way. And it's actually a broader thing, right? Changing how we think about our social life also has to do with changing how we feel about our social life. Really, it's about addressing that subjective root of loneliness, right? All of the other strategies were about the externals. And it turns out that's not actually what's increasing loneliness or what's causing loneliness. It's more about that subjective sense of isolation. So I like to think about this of addressing loneliness from the inside out, right? That's what we need to be doing. So this is where we'll get into the connection with compassion, as you'll see in just a moment. So John summarizes this in this way. When you experience loneliness, you focus more and more on yourself. Your brain engages in self-preservation. You are not necessarily aware of that happening. So it's something happening outside of our awareness that's actually causing us to go into this kind of self-preservation mode that increases, like, as I said earlier, it's kind of like we're putting on armor and engaging more sort of cautiously and defensively in our social interactions. There's sort of more fear, right, as we're approaching social interactions. If you feel vulnerable, you often stop taking empathetic or compassionate positions, and therefore, over time, you lose the social skills. Okay, so now we can see this direct link with compassion. So I won't be talking about all the ways that compassion might help reduce loneliness, but I'm going to address some of them. And the key idea, the big idea, right, is that compassion is working with cultivating a sense of connection with others from the inside out. It's actually working directly, it's targeting directly the subjective roots of our connection with others. And compassion is fundamentally about being able to sort of self-generate the sense of connection, the sense of interconnection with others, such that we could even do it if we're alone in our own apartment at home. Okay, we could feel potentially our interconnection with others. We could feel more connected with strangers and so on. And research shows that compassion does this not just at a thought level, but actually at a feeling level. It's increasing our sense of connectedness, and at a perceptual level, at what we call in psychology research, an automatic way. So research shows when people train in compassion, they see pictures of strangers, they automatically feel more connected to those strangers. Right? So it's getting really to that internal dimension of disconnection and transforming it. And I think there are also some more specific reasons that compassion works. And so I'll show you what I mean. But first, I wanted to have you all do kind of self-assessment about this before we get into this next stage of the talk. So I have here on the screen, and I'm not sure you can see it all, so I'll try and read some of it, especially maybe Zoom people actually have an easier time of seeing it. But you don't have to complete this questionnaire, actually, like fill out the numbers or decide what number you are. But this is a questionnaire we use in research, and I'll talk about what it's for in just a moment. What I want you to do right now is see if there's any of these statements that some part of you resonates with. It kind of tugs on something for you. So you're using it as a kind of microscope or something, a lens that you can use to view your own experience. So at the top, I think it says something like, being too compassionate makes people soft and easy to take advantage of. I worry that if I'm too compassionate, vulnerable people can be drawn to me and drain my emotional resources. I fear that being too compassionate will make me an easy target. Okay, then the second set of questions. I often wonder whether displays of warmth and kindness from others are genuine. If people are kind, I feel they're getting too close. When people are kind and compassionate toward me, I feel anxious or embarrassed. And then lastly, I fear that if I become too compassionate to myself, I will lose my self-criticism and my flaws will show. If I become kinder and less self-critical, then my standards will drop. Or if I start to feel compassion and warmth toward myself, I will feel overcome with a sense of loss and grief. Okay, so what is this getting at? The This comes from a line of research on something called the fears of compassion. Really interesting research suggesting that people actively resist feelings of affiliation and connection with others due to these fears, right? And it's correlated with things like it's correlated with depressive symptomology, with loneliness, right? And it's broken out into these different fears here, and that was the grouping of the questions, right? The first three have to do with fear of compassion for others, so extending compassion to others. Second, receiving compassion from others, so we fear actually being the recipient of care and kindness. And the third is about having compassion toward ourselves and the fear of that. And as I think about this, this is actually pretty consistent with my understanding of what happens with loneliness in this self-preservation mode, right? So we could look at all of these statements as kind of statements about that shutting down or that reduction in our willingness to take empathetic and compassionate positions in our social life. And so it turns out that compassion and compassion training work to target all three of these things. Okay, so at Europa University, we have this compassion training. It's talked about a little bit. And as part of this compassion training program, we're not just working on one style of compassion, right? Not just self-compassion or compassion for others, but we're working on all three of these things. And maybe it's hard to imagine, especially that second one, how do you get better at receiving compassion? But it's something you can practice, right? It's actually an active process. So then we're targeting, I think, all three of these sort of layers of the roots of this sense of self-preservation that perpetuate or that give rise to loneliness over time. And we can get even more specific about it. I think that these first two, other-oriented compassion and receiving compassion, help to kind of undo loneliness in a really interesting way because they're promoting more kind of both and or mutually beneficial relationships, right? There's this actual sense of sort of natural boundary built in when we're training in both extending and receiving care. We're not going to sort of settle for relationships that are just for one or the other, right? So if we're just working on one style of compassion, we may not have as strong of an undoing effect on this problem of loneliness that has to do with the need for mutually beneficial social interactions, the need for mutually beneficial relationships. And then this other piece here, self-compassion, how does that help? Well, I think self-compassion has more to do with those times that we are alone and how we relate to ourselves in those moments of solitude. And so there's this new work happening in this area that I've been learning about that has to do with getting more comfortable with our aloneness, right? And so here's one of the researchers, Matthew Boker, talks about this. If you develop that capacity to be alone, then instead of feeling lonely, you could see solitude as an opportunity to have a meaningful and enjoyable time to get to know yourself a little better, to essentially build a relationship with yourself. And as we understand it, training in self-compassion is about getting kinder toward ourselves, developing a healthier relationship to ourselves, getting out of that habitual pattern of self-criticism, which is actually usually an avoidance pattern of avoiding our own suffering. So through self-compassion, we're turning toward that. We're acknowledging, you know, I would actually like to be more connected with others right now, but there's not others around. What can I do instead, right? And so we could see that time as an opportunity. Turns out people aren't so good at dealing with aloneness sort of in our modern society, at least. I won't say naturally, but in these times. So this is this interesting research where they put people in a room and they removed their smartphone from them and they asked them to hang out for 15 minutes and just be with their thoughts. Okay. But they also had in the room this machine that would allow you to self-administer shocks to yourself. And people, you know, a large number of these people self-administered shocks rather than just sitting there with their own thoughts. And this isn't something they were interested in doing to begin with. Before this, they asked them, you know, how much would somebody have to pay you to not be shocked? And people said, yeah, you'd have to pay me X amount to not be shocked. And yet when they were put in a room by themselves, they'd prefer that over just being with themselves. Okay, so this is no small thing, I think, to develop self-compassion, to develop a better relationship with ourselves. And you can imagine, what is this analogous to? What might we get up to on our own if we don't have a compassionate relationship to ourselves, some kind of self-harm or something like that, right? Something that's maybe not so good for us. So I think all three of these work over time to kind of undo this self-preservation mode that is part of a big part of the loneliness experience. So compassion training, I think, has a real and important place in helping to solve this crisis, this epidemic of loneliness. And if that wasn't convincing enough, this study that I referred to earlier about different areas of the brain that are implicated in the loneliness experience, at the end of this paper, again, just published in 2021, the researchers note that there's this analogous literature of compassion, where they see the same brain regions implicated in compassion, in the studies on compassion, except that they're inversely correlated. Okay, so these same brain regions that have to do with social rejection, now associated with social affiliation, with emotion dysregulation, now associated with better emotion regulation, and so on. So even in the brain itself, this is these overlapping areas between the experience of loneliness and compassion, but in an inverse kind of way. So I think, again, compassion really is an antidote for this problem of loneliness. Now I want to address some common questions that come up when we talk about this kind of thing in our compassion training program. So do these effects of compassion on loneliness remain internal and largely subjective, right? So I talked about it as primarily a sense of subjective isolation. But you might be wondering, do they stay that way? Is it just that now I'm walking around the world, I maybe don't have as many friends still, but I'm just feeling more connected to others? But it turns out that you can measure the relationship between compassion and the development of a richer social life over time as well. This connects with this theory from Barbara Fredrickson called the broaden and build theory of positive emotion. And it basically says that when we are in a more positive emotional state, it's aiming to answer the question of sort of what good are positive emotions? What's the function of positive emotions? Why have we evolved to have positive emotional experiences? It's not just for something that is a reward for a job well done or something like that. It turns out that positive emotions serve certain functions. And this theory aims to articulate that. And it basically says, when we're in a positive emotional state, that broadens our mindset and what's called your thought action repertoire. So it increases the likelihood of you engaging in new ways of thinking, new activities that you might not have previously, and striking up new relationships, new friendships maybe. Okay, and then over time, those new ways of behaving, new ways of thinking, and so on, are likely to build you new resources, right? New skills, new friendships. And that over time, then it's an evolutionary theory, adds to your fitness, or we could say adds to your well-being in modern life. And that has this kind of feedback loop back down to increase the likelihood of further positive emotions in the future. And so it can become this upward spiral. And they talk about how positive emotions can have this kind of undoing effect on negative emotionality over time. One way that I like to think about this practically is like the difference between if you go to a party and you're in a bad mood versus a good mood. And let's say that you show up to the party somewhat like on time, which is usually early, and your friends aren't there yet, right? And so you kind of like just walk into the party and you say, oh my gosh, my friends aren't here yet. I don't know any of these people. What am I going to do, right? And if you're in a bad mood, you might like go in the corner and wait and play on your phone or something like that, right? And just kind of wait for your friends. Maybe you text your friends, where are you, right? But if you're in a good mood and you walk into that party, maybe you're more willing, right, to strike up a conversation with somebody you've never met before. Maybe you even notice there's somebody in the corner on their phone and you're like, hey, you know, that person looks like they need somebody to interact with right now. So you walk over and you strike up an interaction. It actually changes your attention, your scope of awareness in those ways that sort of like a social lubricant increases the likelihood you're willing to approach others. And then let's say that person, you talk to them and you have a lot in common and they become a new friend. Now they're what's, according to this theory, a social resource for you. They're a new friend and you can rely on them. They're a new confidant. And then that contributes to your well-being over time, potentially undoing some loneliness as well. And so research has studied this theory in relation to compassion training. Often in compassion training, we use something called loving kindness meditation, just a particular kind of exercise that you could do internally to sort of strengthen the sense of connectedness to others. And it also is focused on the development of certain wholesome positive emotions. So Barbara Fredrickson wasn't particularly interested in compassion in the study. She was just interested in studying positive emotion, but she used this practice as a way to do that. And she found that when people practice loving kindness meditation, that led to this increase in positive emotion, that led to an increase in various kinds of resources, tangible resources, including more interaction, more positive relationships with other people. And that increased their life satisfaction over time. Now, this is a chart that shows the increase in positive emotion over time. It's interesting if you look at the y-axis here, it's not actually that big, that market of an increase in the amount of positive emotions people are reporting. They're practicing meditation along the x-axis over 8 weeks. So it's a pretty subtle shift how these practices actually increase positive emotion. It may not even be fully noticeable in our awareness. Similar to how John Cassiopea said, it may not be noticeable, the self-preservation mode that we go into when we're feeling lonely or socially rejected, right? And yet, nonetheless, it's sort of in the background of our experience, informing our behavior and changing our behavior in ways that help us build new resources over time. So Barbara Fredrickson summed up her findings in these ways. The findings are clear-cut. The practice of loving kindness meditation, compassion meditation led to shifts in people's daily experiences of a wide range of positive emotions, including love, joy, gratitude, contentment, hope, pride, interest, amusement, and awe. Okay, so it's not just increasing this sense of compassion, right? It's actually having this spillover effect on our whole positive affect system. These shifts in positive emotions took time to appear and were not large in magnitude, but they were linked to increases in a variety of personal resources, listing them here, including mindful attention, self-acceptance. The one we're particularly interested in is that positive relations with others. And this had to do as well with increased quantity of interactions with others. And good physical health, better physical health, lower symptoms on these scales that are commonly used to measure our physical health. Moreover, these gains in personal resources were consequential. They enabled people to become more satisfied with their lives and to experience fewer symptoms of depression. Simply put, by elevating people's daily experiences of positive emotions, the practice led to long-term gains that made genuine differences in people's lives. So there's this potential that this practice of compassion is not just changing or altering our internal experience, but this theory helps us understand how that could actually result in shifts in our external social life as well, a richer social life. And I think this also highlights this kind of both and of compassion. I think we sometimes get into this idea that in order to benefit others, we need to sort of sacrifice something of our own well-being in the process. And what this research shows is that no, it actually, compassion training, compassion meditation makes us feel better. And in the process, or as a result, we might be more likely to engage in helpful behaviors for others as well. Okay, another question or fear that comes up, it's related to the fears of compassion, right? Won't compassion make me too open and soft? I feel like I need less of those qualities, not more. So a lot of times people who are drawn to compassion, maybe you in the audience tonight, drawn to this topic, we're naturally empathetic people. And sometimes we relate to this term that my students tell me, I'm an empath. Okay, so I'm someone who's more sensitive to the emotions of others and I take them on too much. So this seems like a bad idea for me, right? To practice something that's going to involve more of that. But it turns out that there's a difference between compassion and that kind of experience. Compassion isn't about taking on more of other people's stuff, as we'll talk about in just a moment here. Okay, this relates to what I talk about as two sort of juxtaposed challenges of our social life, especially the emotion-related challenges of our social life. On one hand, emotions help us connect with others. Okay, they're this kind of social glue, and research shows that emotions facilitate social synchrony. So sort of when we're in interaction, we synchronize more with others, and a big part of that is the emotions that occur. So emotions, sharing in the emotional experience of others, helps us feel connection. On the other hand, people experience, too much of that sometimes. They feel like I lost myself in the midst of that social interaction. I lost myself in sharing in the emotions of others, and I no longer can really differentiate what's mine and what's theirs, right? So there's also this need for emotional autonomy to have healthier relationships. We need to be able to tell what's mine and what's yours, where do I end and you begin, and so on, right? So we need emotional connection on one hand and emotional autonomy on the other. And those are seemingly in tension with one another. And when people hear about compassion and compassion training, a lot of times they think it's just like this warm and fuzzy thing that's going to help me just feel more of what's on the left up there, right? I'm just going to get more and more in this state of sharing in the experience of others. But what if I don't want that because I do too much of that already? When in fact, research shows, and I'll talk about the research in just a moment, that compassion actually falls more toward the middle if this was a spectrum, right? It allows us to experience both connection and containment together, okay? Or emotional relatedness and emotional autonomy together. How is that possible? How is it? Because when I think about compassion, it doesn't seem that way, right? But if you look at neuroscience research on compassion, when people train in this, when we actually practice this quality of compassion, we see, yes, there's an increase in activation in areas of the brain that are associated with empathy. So it is true that it's increasing our empathy in some sense. But we also see increased activation in areas of the brain associated with emotion regulation. So as I think about it, compassion is like empathy plus emotion regulation. That's a simple way of thinking about it. And we may get into this, and we'll get into it definitely in Charlotta's piece, where you'll start to maybe feel some of that difference between empathy and compassion. But compassion is sort of a more conscious form of empathy, you could say that allows us to maintain or have this sort of buffer between our experience and the experience of others. And a lot of it has to do with the role of positive emotion in compassion experience. Okay, in fact, why don't we just try this out now? I did this earlier in the educators workshop, but we'll just do this briefly. So if some of you were there, I apologize that you might have done this already. Hopefully not bad to do it again. So take a moment to think of someone, a situation, someone that is in your life right now, maybe a coworker, depending on if you're working in a field, a helping profession, one of your clients or something like that, that sparks empathy for you. Call them to mind. And notice what that does to you. What's the influence of that empathy? Depending on what you're empathizing with, often people describe this experience as there's a kind of taking in, right? There's this receiving of information and of energy, but also potentially a kind of heaviness or stuckness. Earlier, someone used the term helplessness when they were asked to call to mind someone that sparked empathy. Okay, an alternative to that, what I think of as a compassion spark, I want you to call to mind something that sort of naturally evokes the sense of care and affiliation and inner warmth. Okay, research shows, interestingly, that for many people, it's easier to do this with an animal than another human being. Okay, so you can think about a pet if you'd like. I asked my wife, who works in hospice, what her compassion spark is, and she said an elderly person that has dementia. They're sort of, in the state that they just really need attention and care. So it can be a human, it could be an animal. Sometimes for people, it's a gesture, like they put their hand on their heart. They naturally feel this warmth and affection. What does that feel like? Okay, that's more similar to compassion than the empathy spark exercise that I just did. This compassion spark is moving us in the direction of a full compassion experience. It's not the entire story, but it's moving us in that direction. And that's more about what compassion is than the empathy piece that makes us sort of feel heavier and like we're passively receiving something. Compassion is more active. It involves what we call in research proactive emotion generation. So when we feel that spark, when we call to mind something that makes us feel that inner warmth and so on, there's this kind of self-generation of this feeling of connectedness, right? We're able to call to mind something that helps us feel connected. See how that might be connected to loneliness, to overcoming loneliness? All right, and I like to talk about this as well because people fear that if I'm compassionate, I'll lose my sense of boundaries. Okay, I won't be able to say no and so on. You know, I already have too much again of that issue of self-sacrifice or martyrdom or something like that. So if I train in compassion, I'm just going to be doing more of that, and I don't want to be doing more of that. But as I think about it, actually, compassion helps us dynamically dial up and down different aspects of empathy. And when we train in both self-compassion, I'll get that off the screen, put this back up here, it's maybe too much. When we train in both self and other compassion, then we have this sense of natural self-respect and care toward ourselves, right? We're not going to do something then, if we're trained in that, that's going to involve abandoning ourselves in the service of others. We have an understanding now that that's not going to result in the long term in more well-being for us or others when we abandon ourselves, right? And similarly, we're not going to abandon others in the pursuit of our own self-compassion, right? That's also contributing to poor boundaries over time. So training in both and allows us to have these more both and relationships and interactions over time that contribute to natural boundaries from the inside out. We don't have to practice saying no. We don't have to, you know, maybe we need to do those things as well. But a lot of what you read about in terms of getting better at boundaries is about sort of rehearsing different scripts and so on, right? But through training in compassion, both self and other, arising from within us is this natural self-respect and respect for others. And we get to creatively work on balancing those two. Right. Maybe you've heard this term as well, compassion fatigue. This is related. So won't cultivating more compassion contribute to burnout over time? So it's somewhat of an unfortunate reality that this term compassion fatigue has become so popular, especially among helping professionals, because in scientific literature now, there's debates about this idea that compassion fatigue is actually the wrong term. That really, it's not about people being in a compassionate place and working with others that's contributing to burnout over time. It's instead about being in an empathic state. Okay. And so when we're just in that passive receiving mode with empathy, we're feeling with the experience of others. When we encounter others who are suffering, like a nurse working with a patient or whatever, there's this automatic resonance with. And it turns out that it's automatic and subconscious that we do that. Research shows that we can't repress it, even if we try. But what is our natural tendency? Our natural tendency when we feel something uncomfortable is to try and avoid that experience, right? So when we feel empathy for suffering, most people's automatic response, totally fine, is we both feel with, and then we try in some way avoid that experience. Okay, we're trying to get rid of it out of our experience. And that involves in some kind of top-down suppression or control of our emotions. But because it's a natural experience and because it's occurring subconsciously and it's irrepressible, and there's studies that show if somebody's doing a complicated math problem in their head, really distracted, and then you show them a picture of someone else, they still do this empathy thing. Their brain is still empathizing with the picture, even though they're distracted by other stuff. So we can't avoid it. And so when we try and avoid it within our experience, we are kind of wasting effort. And that's contributing to more burnout over time. So compassion alternatively works with this experience by saying, hey, it's inevitable that we're going to experience an overlap of self and other because our nervous systems are wired in this way. So instead of rejecting that aspect of who I am, I'm going to embrace it. And whenever that experience comes along, I'm going to lean into that experience, and I'm going to join that with a more conscious process of natural affection and care. And that allows me to feel actually more energy for the situation rather than less. I did this activity earlier too, but I think it's too good to not do it here. So to demonstrate this kind of thing of trying to avoid something natural, over the next 30 seconds, okay, or so, I want you to sincerely try to not think of a white bear. Okay, so you could close your eyes if you want. You can have your eyes open, doesn't matter. Try to not think of a white bear. Did we succeed? Is it possible? No. Some people succeed actually at this. I've discovered over time. Some people have some strategy or something like that where they don't think of the bear. This was first mentioned by Dostoevsky in 1863, this task of trying not to think of a white bear, and it comes to mind every minute. It's since been studied in psychology. It's called the white bear problem. And it has to do with the way that our minds and brains work, that when we try and avoid something, actually more of the brain goes and starts processing that thing, right? So even if we're successful in the short term at avoiding that thing, there's this rebound effect, research shows, where after the activity stops, your avoidance strategy stops, then that white bear just comes to mind more and more and more. Okay, so it's not possible to avoid stuff that's natural to us. And that's why research shows, that compassion contributes to good health, better health, and more likelihood to help others over the long term. Whereas empathy alone is contributing to poor health, burnout, withdrawal, and actually less likelihood to help over the long term. So to close here, I want to end on a sort of hopeful note, referring back toward the beginning of this talk when I talked about loneliness as being contagious. Because another way of looking at this chart here is not just that loneliness is contagious, but actually our sense of connection is contagious as well. Each individual node on here, yes, as they became lonelier over time, increased the likelihood of others becoming lonelier over time. But if individuals became less lonely over time, that increased the likelihood of those around them becoming less lonely over time as well. Right? We can see this more directly in things like contagious happiness. So positive emotion is also spreads from us to others up to 3 degrees of influence. And we see this in actual pro-social behaviors. So acts of kindness spread up to 3 degrees in social networks. So in some sense, each time that we're choosing compassion, right, we're acting as a helpful counterforce to loneliness. And we could do this exercise, but I'll just walk through this now. Maybe you'd be interested in doing this later. What is your scope of influence? If we calculate actually how many people are you affecting if you're having up to 3 degrees of influence, then you could estimate kind of the size of your close ties, which are the people that you see regularly. So close ties is just basically like you would call them a close other. You're close to that other person. And then if you square that number and then cube that number and then add those numbers together, you get an estimate of how big of an influence you're having on your social network, right? So let's say you had 10 close others. Then there's 100 friends of friends, or 100 friends. Yeah, 100 friends of friends. And 1,000 friends of friends of friends. And when you add all that together, you're influencing through your loneliness or your sense of compassion over 1,000 people. Right? That's quite a bit of power, quite a bit of influence. So I hope that idea, the sort of new understanding of this influence that you have, each time that you choose compassion, you're acting as a counterforce to this epidemic of loneliness. Sort of helps you feel this is a source of compassionate resilience for you over time. So we've got about 10 minutes, 8 minutes or so. If there's any questions about this, nothing I maybe didn't say, you could ask questions during. Is there any questions about what I presented? And we can also go to Zoom. If people have questions on Zoom, they can just type it in the chat. Nothing on Zoom either. So we'll transition in a few. Charlotta's going to come up and present some more about, in this case, self-compassion. So we'll get to practice some of that. All right, no questions. Charlotte, are you going to want a chair up here, you think, or? Okay. Plan on that now. All right. Thank you all. No screen, right?
Hi, everyone. Hello to you on Zoom. So my offering is on tools of self-compassion. And I thought our first tool of self-compassion is to take a little break. So there's some in our room, there's great water and peanuts and chocolates. Those of you on Zoom, if you want to get up and stretch or get a glass of something to drink. So why don't we just take 2 minutes and do whatever you want to do. If you want to like take a 2-minute nap, go for it. Get refreshments. We'll do that just for a little bit. Okay. So what I wanted to share, as I said, tools of self-compassion. So a little bit about what is self-compassion, what is it not, and how do we actually practice self-compassion? What might we do if we want to be compassionate with ourselves? So first, a basic definition. What are we talking about with self-compassion? And Jordan referred to this, but this is sort of my own take on it. Self-compassion is a basic attitude of kindness or of warmth, acceptance towards ourselves, particularly towards our challenges, in the face of challenges. And then I'm going to add this piece that there's a willingness in self-compassion to cultivate behaviors or states of mind that promote well-being. So the sort of more active piece of cultivating other ways of thinking and behaving. So as Jordan mentioned, self-compassion is also begins with meeting our pain, meeting our suffering, noticing where we feel a sense of lack or possibly failure or fault. And so immediately in the practice of self-compassion, we become aware of all the ways that we criticize of ourselves, all the ways we judge ourselves, all the stories, negative storylines we have about ourselves. And I think often, again, compassion, we have this sense, oh, it's about others. And those in helping professions can have that sense of, well, compassion is really about the other. And it is, it's wonderful. But in that, sometimes we lose a sense of ourselves. We lose taking care of ourselves in favor, as though it were some decision we have to make of either taking care of others or of ourselves. And this leads obviously to a kind of anxiety, to burnout, to stress, to poor health, to not feeling well. And in not feeling well and not feeling good about ourselves because we're not taking care of ourselves, we isolate ourselves. And this was really the point of Jordan's talk so much, of noticing how the less well we feel about ourselves, the more likely we're to withdraw, the more likely we are to not engage with others, not take care, actually to pull back and isolate. And when we do that in our own, that self-criticism we might have of ourselves, we end up actually being more critical of others, right? Do you know that experience of noticing the people you're most judgmental of? And if you sit down and think about it, often we have those aspects in our own personalities, and we least like that about ourselves. So our critique of ourselves, our aggression towards ourselves, is not something that we can just hold in. It actually starts to bleed out of us. It affects our behavior. It affects how we interact with others. So one question, it's sort of a living question that I'll pose to you. I think this is an ongoing question, is what is the relationship between self-compassion and compassion for others? Does one come first? Does one follow on the other? Do they always come together? And here I'll offer a quotation by a woman named Pema Chodron, who writes a lot about compassion. And she says, "Without loving kindness for ourselves, it is difficult, if not impossible, to genuinely feel it for others." If we don't feel it for ourselves, it's difficult to feel for others. My sense here, and Jordan and I have great conversations about this, but is that the two really go together. The two almost is this image of like a figure eight, where compassion for self and compassion for other reinforce and inspire each other. But we are always part of it. Our compassion, our loving kindness for ourselves is always part of the whole field of compassion. So before we dive more into how do I practice self-compassion, I thought to say a few things about what self-compassion is not. Because those fears of compassion that Jordan showed us, a lot of them point to maybe some judgments we have of self-compassion. So one thing, self-compassion is not self-pity. It's not self-absorption. It's not self-indulgence, right? If you think about what is self-pity, what does that feel like? It's actually where we get really tightly focused around ourselves, right? There's almost like we weave ourselves in this tight cocoon. Things get really claustrophobic in our experience. And in a way, we separate ourselves from others in self-pity, right? We feel alone when we feel self-pity. We isolate. And we, in a way, concretize ourselves in opposition to others, right? What has happened to me and who's out there? So we become more closed off. Self-compassion is also not self-gratification. And here I want to make a distinction between want and need. So self-gratification is that sense like I get whatever I want. And I know at the end of a hard day, sometimes I'm like, I'm going to give myself a treat. And that's self-compassion. And yes, that's great sometimes. But I think we can all sense where we go over into self-gratification that ends up not really being self-compassionate, where rather than just having a few scoops of ice cream, we end up having the whole pint. And so rather than actually feeling good at the end of the night because we treated ourselves, we end up with a stomach ache. So here, this distinction between want and need is really critical. And self-compassion, it's not just what do I want, because I might want that ice cream, but what do I really need? What's the need beneath the want? And usually the need is a little more subtle, a little more evasive, because maybe what I need is actually to be able to unwind, to relax, to just feel okay, to let go. But it's important in self-compassion to see what is that deeper level of need. because that's really what self-compassion is, as opposed to the sort of more surface level of self-gratification. Self-compassion is also not letting ourselves off the hook, right? We might think, well, if I'm self-compassionate, I'm really not taking responsibility. It's sort of an out. And self-compassion isn't an out. Jordan mentioned a little bit about space. And self-compassion is really about creating more space around our experience. And when we create more space around what has happened or what our feeling is, we're actually more able to look at our role in a difficult situation, look at what we might have done, how we might have done something differently. Our minds are more expansive. When we bring the kind of warmth and kindness of self-compassion, it's not letting ourselves off the hook, but actually giving ourselves a chance to see, maybe I could have said it that way. Maybe I could have done this. We give ourselves more leeway in the positive sense of being able to develop. It's not an out. And then finally, self-compassion is not ordinary, what we would call self-esteem, what I'll call ordinary or regular self-esteem. Because self-esteem is built on success, right? I did X, Y, and Z. I accomplished this. I did that. Now I can feel good about myself. What's the problem with that kind of self-esteem or that kind of self-compassion is it doesn't always work out that way, right? We don't always accomplish X, Y, and Z. It doesn't always work out the way we had hoped. So self-compassion isn't about feeling good about ourselves when we do well, but could we actually have kindness towards ourselves when we don't do well, when we quote unquote fail? So self-esteem alone is really shaky territory. And it's built on self-evaluation, and it's built on comparison with others, and sometimes with a kind of perfectionism. So then what is self-compassion? What are we talking about? So it's a basic attitude of kindness, we've already said. There's a contemplative psychotherapist, sort of the grandfather of contemplative psychotherapy, named Ed Podville. And he writes about self-compassion as basic warmth towards yourself. Basic warmth towards yourself. And there's another teacher, Angel Kyoto Williams, African-American Zen teacher, who writes about self-compassion as becoming friends with yourself, becoming friends with yourself. And I love this idea of friendship, because if you think about like a really good friend, sometimes you have a wonderful time together, right? You go out, you talk, you enjoy yourself, you laugh. Sometimes you cry together. Sometimes you're cranky with each other. Sometimes you're bored with each other. A really good friend, you get to do all of those things with. So to become friends with ourselves is, what if I could be all those ways with myself? Sometimes have a totally fantastic time with myself. Sometimes be super cranky with myself. Sometimes be kind of bored. Oh, here I go again. And let all of that be okay. So there's a sense in self-compassion of gentleness, actually, workability, a willingness to make whatever arises be workable, however I experience things. And ultimately, there's this notion of unconditional friendliness. I love this, unconditional friendliness. Could we connect with ourselves at this really deep level of being a human and recognizing, like all other humans, we wish to be happy and we wish not to suffer. And almost everything we do, probably everything we do, is motivated from somewhere, from that basic wish for happiness and not to suffer. So when we recognize that in ourselves and we recognize it in others, there's some unconditional quality of friendliness that might emerge. Okay, so now to some of the tools of self-compassion. How do we cultivate this? So tool number one, awareness. Awareness. And what we all know this word mindfulness. Mindfulness, becoming present, arriving just where we are. So here, I think we know this as humans. There's a tendency for us to think that there's a more perfect moment out there, a more perfect me, a more perfect situation. If only I were there, or if only I had done that. It always gets us out of right now. There's a wonderful line from a poem by the poet Wendell Berry, and he says, that old dream of going, of becoming a better man just by getting up and going to another place. That old dream of going, of getting up, of becoming a better man just by getting up and going to another place. And I hope you resonate in some way, some part of this being human of like, it's just out there, right? Just around the corner. And there can be a type of aggression in that, because it's an unwillingness to say, well, what about right now? What about who I am right now? What about the people I'm with right now? What about the place I'm in right now? What about the stage of life I'm in right now? What about that? What if that could be good enough? So self-compassion, beginning with mindfulness, being willing to show up right here, right now, as we are, in all our knowing and not knowingness, our beauty and our ugliness, our confusion, all of it. It's so simple in some ways, and actually it's totally radical to show up just as we are right now. So how do we do that? Our sense perceptions are a wonderful way to show up right now, because we don't hear yesterday, we don't see tomorrow, we don't smell 5 minutes ago. Whenever we awaken our sense perceptions, we're here. So I'm going to invite you in this moment to look around. If you're at home on Zoom, you've got lots of things to look at here in this room. So let your eyes wander. Mindfulness of sight. So we notice what we've already noticed, but then notice something you haven't noticed. Bring awareness to our hearing. So you hear my voice, but then there's other things that we can hear. Notice what else you hear. There's a sensation of touch. So feel what parts of your skin are cool or hot, where you feel the pressure of clothes, pressure of the seat, ground. Taste and smell are often a little more subtle, but see what you notice. Always smells different behind a mask, I find. So we're just noticing, right? But mindfulness, this is the beginning of self-compassion. I'm here right now. I'm alive right now in this moment. So the next tool of compassion, self-compassion, is acceptance. And as we become mindful, right, we begin to notice more just in those last few seconds. Raise your hand if you noticed something you hadn't noticed before. Great. So we notice more, right, just by looking around, just by smelling, by hearing. But then we begin to notice even more. Once we become mindful, once we arrive here, what do I begin to notice? I begin to notice maybe some feelings. Begin to notice, am I beginning to get sleepy? Is there a thought? Is there a memory? Is there a feeling that I'm tapping into as I'm bringing mindfulness to right now, awareness to right now? Maybe there's excitement about something coming up. Maybe there's some joy. Maybe there's tension. Maybe there's frustration. So as we bring awareness, things start opening. That's part of the radical aspect of awareness. So the second step of acceptance is to say, what if as I become more aware, I'm also willing to take in what I experience, take in what I become aware of, meet it. So acceptance doesn't mean we're condoning what our experience is or we're resigning ourselves to it. It's actually about recognizing. Acceptance is recognizing what's going on for me. And usually a lot of things are going on. There's wonderful things going on inside of us. And there's perhaps more shadowy aspects. Maybe we feel into the loneliness Jordan was talking about, or we feel into sadness. Do you have those days where you wake up and you're just kind of sad? I have those. It just sort of follows me like a shadow. And at some point I say, how about I just be with that sadness? Accept it, turn towards it, say, great, come along. Today we hang out together. Acceptance is, as again, kind of radical, being willing to see how we are and be with it, allow it. So as a mother, this has been a phenomenal journey. I remember early when my kids were little, one day I looked at my husband and I said, you know what? Sometimes I don't like my kids. And I thought, oh my God, that's so awful. I don't know, at least before I was a mother, I thought, well, mothers, once you become a mother, you love kids, you love all kids, you want to play all the time, you think they're the sweetest things. Your heart just goes out, you do anything for them. A lot of that's true. And as I discovered, at least, hopefully some other parents in the room will back me up on this, but you also realize, or I did, sometimes I don't like my kids. And I could tell that initially I didn't want to admit it. But that when I looked closely, I was like, no, that's happening. And what does acceptance do in that moment? Acceptance says, okay, something's happening here. Something is calling, something's knocking. What is that? What's the frustration? What's the irritation? Maybe it means I need to take a break. Maybe I need to have some time alone, or maybe I need to address what my kid is doing that's really irritating, hurting me in some way, so I can address it. If I never let myself feel or accept that I don't like my kids right now, I would never go there. So that compassion for myself begins by actually recognizing, allowing, welcoming that. And then that actually spreads to my kids, right? I actually can address it with them. So I want to invite you into what we call the welcoming practice, or kind of non-practice welcoming exercise. So I'll talk you through this. This is a wonderful tool of self-compassion you can take on the road. So we started with mindfulness, right? Of becoming aware of the space we're in. So I'll invite you back into that. Let your sense perceptions wake up. And now what we're doing, in addition to noticing, is we're welcoming. So notice sound and generate this basic attitude of welcoming the sound. As your eyes take in things, welcome what your eyes take in. as you taste, as you feel sensations on your skin. Don't just notice, but welcome those. Welcome the taste. Welcome the smell. And notice what thoughts might be going through your mind right now, feelings. Welcome them. Welcome the thought. Welcome the feeling. Whatever it is. And as we notice and welcome, there are other layers that might start to arise. Other layers of feelings, thoughts. Welcome. If you feel like you don't want to welcome something, then welcome the feeling of not wanting to welcome. Can do this all day, but I'll stop. But you can keep welcoming. It's actually a beautiful attitude to bring into life. Is anyone willing to share what came up for you as you were welcoming?
So once we started noticing sound, there's a little clicking sound, and I didn't notice it at first. And then once we started welcoming, I welcomed that was rhythmic. Rather than that I could just actually now it was attuned to this clicking sound. I continued.
Say again the last bit. Do you recognize that it was a rhythmic sound? Yeah, great. Thank you. So those of you on Zoom, there's a clicking sound, and I thought there was like a real old-fashioned clock in here, but I can't find it. So Tammy was saying yes, hearing the sound and then noticing that it's a rhythmic sound. Thank you. One more person. Something you noticed and welcomed. It's really uncomfortable standing in silence, isn't it? Then we can welcome that. Okay, we'll keep going. Okay, so awareness, acceptance, is tools of self-compassion. So the third tool of compassion here is kindness and warmth towards our experience, however that arises. And really this sense of warmth, it's almost like the fuel of compassion. That as we bring awareness into this sort of radical coming present, and we open that sense of welcoming and acceptance to whatever we find, can we then, in addition, offer kindness to what arises? Can we offer warmth to what arises? In a way, this warmth, and Jordan talked about, is care. Can we care for what's arising in our experience? Can we care for that sense of doubt? Can we care for our sense of insecurity? Can we care for our fear? Can we care for our anxiety? That's what self-compassion is, right? This attitude of caring for all aspects of our experience as they arise. And how do we connect in with this sense of care? Jordan spoke about the compassion spark, so that's one way in. And here's a slightly different way in, but we're going to the same spot. And this spot, as the founder of Naropa writes about it, as the soft spot. We all have a soft spot where the world touches us, where things move us. He says, even the worst monster seemingly loves something. Loves something. So what's our soft spot? When we talk about the soft spot, what do you love? What do you love? That's the way in to our sense of care. And we all love something, right? It might be an animal. It might be a human. Maybe it's a place. You live in a beautiful state here, as do we, luckily. So we have lots of beautiful places. But even growing up in New York, I had a favorite place in Central Park. Or maybe you love to do a certain thing, an activity. So I invite you right now to feel into, what do you love? What is it that opens you to your soft spot? Feel into that. Imagine if it's a place, imagine you're there. If it's an activity, imagine you're doing it. If it's a being, bring them to mind. And so notice what happens as you go there. How does your body feel? What happens to your being? For me, there's a sense of openness that arises. One of the things I love to do is first thing in the morning, open the door. My kitchen, I feed the cats, and then I open the door, and there's this beautiful mountainside. I take a deep breath of air, and I look at the mountain, and I see the cool. I feel now it's beginning to feel the coolness. And I look up the mountain, I look at the sky, and there's just a brief moment of opening. Something I love to do. So when I imagine that, my body opens, my heart opens. And so in compassion and self-compassion, go to the places you love. And that what opens in you, that warmth, let it radiate. Let it radiate through your body. Let it radiate through your being. Let it infuse your being. So just a couple more things. One is I wanted to touch briefly on what gets in the way of self-compassion. And one thing is our judgment, our layers of suffering, right? We all have pain. It's part of human experience. But then we layer it, right? We have a story about why we shouldn't have felt it, or how we could have done it differently, or what it says about us. And so we don't just have the pain, but we have the suffering that goes on top of the pain. We have the stories that go over the natural suffering that's part of all of human existence. And so part of self-compassion is to recognize, what are those stories that I lay over the pain that's part of existence? And this is part of that definition when I said there's a willingness to cultivate behavior and mental states that promote well-being. What are those stories? So I invite you right now, what are some stories you have about yourself that you layer over the pains and losses that are going to be natural in life? So one of my favorite sort of slogans for self-compassion or a lot of life is, don't believe everything you think. Don't believe everything you think. If you're like me, can believe a lot of what I think. It's a thought and it becomes very serious very quickly. Just because we think it doesn't mean we have to believe it, doesn't mean it has to be true. Could we let that story go? The image that helps me sometimes is like a balloon. You know, you hold it, and then you let it go. It goes. So what are those stories that even just bringing awareness to them, we release some of their grip on us, and could we let them go just a bit? Another aspect of that gets in the way of self-compassion is our sense of isolation in our suffering, right? As I spoke about earlier and Jordan spoke to, that we feel like we're all alone in it. We're all alone in our pain. And so part of self-compassion practice is actually to recognize the ways we're connected. There's an old sort of story. It's of a woman, a mother, who's lost her young child. Her child has died. And she hears about a wise man. And people say, go to the wise man. Maybe he'll be able to bring your child back to life. And she goes to him and she says, please, my child has just died. Can you help me? Can you bring my child back to life? And the wise man says, I will help you. But first go into the village and bring me a mustard seed from a family that has not experienced death, and then I will help you. And so she goes to the first house and she knocks on the door very excitedly. Please tell me, has anyone died in your family? And they say, yes, well, 2 weeks ago, our grandfather passed. He had a beautiful long life, but he's passed. She expresses her condolences. She goes to the next house. Has anyone died in your family? Yes, of course. And so, as you can imagine, she goes from door to door through the whole village, and not one family has never experienced death. And so she comes back to the wise man, and she says, I understand. I understand there is no way out of death. I don't expect you to bring my child back to life. So where is our suffering actually a point of connection to the suffering of others, of humanity? Where can it be an entryway to our sense of profound connectedness to each other? And it often and usually can be. So here, finally, I'll just end, what are the fruits of self-compassion? And one is there is greater ease, greater comfort with ourselves. Imagine what if you could feel anything, if anything could arise in your experience and somehow you'd be able to hold it with kindness, with equanimity, with spaciousness. That quality of fearlessness that might come into our sense of approaching life, the joy that might come. And at a deeper level, I think self-compassion opens us to something that I would call inherent self-worth. That we are good just as we are. It's not the self-esteem that I was talking about earlier that's based on accomplishments, because that's tenuous, as I mentioned, but primordial self-esteem, just because we are, just because beingness is, we are beings. And that is phenomenal. That's brilliant. That's our inherent dignity. If we can step into that, our inherent dignity. not because of anything, not in spite of anything, but just because we are. And I think it's one of the greatest gifts we give ourselves and each other. Can I see the inherent dignity in another human being? Can I feel it in myself? I'd like to close with just a short guided practice. And this practice was developed by a teacher named Ram Dass and others, but it's slightly amended, so this is a shortened version of it. So I'm going to invite you, those of you in the room, to look around and just take into your awareness the different human beings sitting in this room. There are not so many, so just see them and take maybe like 3 people, really notice them. Notice what they're wearing, notice something about them. 3, so at least 3. And those of you on Zoom, let's see, if you want to, okay, Zoom folks, imagine, bring to mind, I'm going to invite you to imagine 3 people that you've encountered in the last week or so. Some of them you know, some maybe you passed in some more neutral setting. Okay, so let's start and invite you to close your eyes if you're okay with that. And bring to mind, well, let's first start just by coming back into that moment of mindfulness, remember? Feeling body, feeling your sense perceptions. Maybe taking a nice breath, just here at the end of the day, relaxing. And invite you to bring to mind one person that you looked around and saw in the room. Or for those of you on Zoom, bring to mind one person you encountered today or recently. Really hold them in your mind's eye for a moment. If you're here in this room, become aware where they are in relationship to you, next to you, behind you, in front of you. Hold them as a human being in your awareness. This person has a body and a mind, just like me. This person has feelings, emotions, and thoughts, just like me. This person has experienced physical and emotional pain, just like me. And now I invite you to move to the second person. You remember from looking around the room, or if you're on Zoom, switch to a second person. Maybe someone you passed on the street, saw in the grocery store, interacted with in some way. So bring them into your awareness. If you're in the room, really feel where are they in relationship to you? Where are they sitting? What do you remember about them? Just looking at them. Connect with their presence for a moment. This person worries and is frightened sometimes, just like me. This person has longed for friendship, just like me. This person has felt joy, just like me. Now, turn to the third person you noticed. If you're on Zoom, choose a third person. Just notice who arises in your mind's eye. If you're in the room, notice shifting your awareness to this third person. Where are they located in relationship to you? This person has felt lonely, just like me. This person has sometimes been angry, just like me. This person has experienced loss, just like me. And now continuing to hold this person in your awareness. I wish that this person have the strength, resources, and support to navigate the difficulties of life with ease. I wish that this person be free from pain and suffering. I wish that this person be happy and at peace. I wish that this person be loved, because this person is a fellow human being, just like me. And finally, bring your awareness to everyone in this room, everyone who's joining us via Zoom, maybe other beings in this building. Just feeling those of us gathered here in this moment. I wish that these people be free from pain and suffering. I wish that these people be happy and at peace. I wish that these people be loved. Because these people are fellow human beings, just like me. So you can let any kind of visualization go. Just feel your seat beneath you again, natural breathing. If you've had your eyes closed, feel free to open them. Thank you, fellow human beings, for being here tonight, sharing this time with us. And thank you again, Elfie, and blessings for all the work that you do and this amazing gathering of everything this week. Blessings to the whole community here. Thank you.
Any questions or Zoom? I just want to give a minute for that. You know, it's like.
Thanks. Say thanks. Got it right there.
Thank you, Zoom friends.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Appreciate you joining us this evening, and thank you again, Charlotte and Jordan. Really appreciate your wisdom. Importance of the message you share. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you.
If anyone does have questions, we'll hang out. So if you do. Thank you. I mean, I can, but I probably will.
Yeah.
Thanks for your sharing.
Messages that are so good.
I'm just visiting Jakey, so this is like special treat to like come into town.
Okay.
I'll see you guys then.
For universe. I didn't think that afterwards.
Can we find it?